Hello again, Sioux High Earth Science students. Yes, this is Mr. McLeod again with another awesome astronomy podcast. Today, we will be looking at the life cycle of several different types of stars, including our sun. We will also be looking at the placement of these stars on what's called a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, also called an HR diagram. We will also look at how stars move on this diagram based on the stage of life they are in. So get your notes out, something to write with, and let's do this thing. Okay, now, recall that stars are born in areas of space referred to as nebulas, also called stellar nurseries. If you need to repeat that in your notes, write that down again. Nebulae are often named by their shape, like the Tarantula Nebula in this slide in the upper right. However, sometimes they're referred to by a designation that combines a letter with a number, like the gaseous pillars above called M16. That's on the left-hand side. These pictures were taken using some very powerful space telescopes. On the left-hand side, the gaseous pillars were taken by HST. That refers to the Hubble Space Telescope, which took the picture of M16. And on the right, you have a picture taken by the Spitzer Space Telescope, which took a picture of the Tarantula Nebula. Excellent pictures, good examples of stellar nurseries or nebulae. Okay, also recall that stars shine with different colors based on their size and the amount of radiation generated by their cores. If you need to write that down again in your notes, do so now. If you look at this slide above, it gives 3 examples of stars that shine with different colors, A, B, and C. Locate them all in the picture above. Then in your notes, write the 3 examples and their relative temperatures. Blue for hottest, green for warm, and red for cool. We'll be using those later on in this podcast. So get those down in your notes now. This should all now make sense based on our earlier discussion of the wavelengths of each color in the visible spectrum. Using the diagram in this slide, recall that the color blue had very short wavelengths and therefore a lot of energy. Therefore, those stars would be hot stars. Write that in your notes. You'll also see that while the color red has very long wavelengths, it has a smaller amount of energy and therefore would be relatively cool. So write that down in your notes as well. Okay. The above diagram is referred to as a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, also referred to as an HR diagram. This diagram is named after Einar Hertzsprung and the American astronomer Henry Norris Russell, who developed it. Write these names in your notes now. Now, the HR diagram classifies stars based on their luminosity, temperature, absolute magnitude, and brightness. Write that down in your notes. Now, we've just discussed that the temperature of each star is determined by its color. If you need to write that down again, do it now. Blue stars are hot, yellow and green are warm, while red stars are cooler. Now, take a few minutes and reproduce the above diagram in your notes, all of it, so that we can use it later in class. So reproduce that diagram now and then get back to me. Okay, let's take a look at that diagram in more detail. On the left-hand side, you'll see the term luminosity. Write in your notes that luminosity refers to the brightness of stars. So luminosity refers to the brightness of stars. Now, in any HR diagram, our sun's luminosity is the baseline for comparing the brightness of all other stars. Therefore, it's given a value of 1. Write that down. If we locate our sun on the HR diagram, and here it is on this diagram, and move left across to luminosity, so we move across this way toward luminosity, we see its value at something around 1. This diagram also gives us a basic idea of the relative size of each star. You can see now that each of these circles represents the size of a star. So you have some very small ones, you have some medium-sized ones here, and then in the upper right you have some very large ones. Based on the size of our sun in this diagram, we can see it's a pretty average, maybe even small-sized star. We call it small to medium-sized. Get that in your notes. You can also see from the size of the circles representing the stars that there are many, many stars larger than our sun, and some referred to as giants as well. Now, if this were an astronomy class, we'd get into absolute magnitude and what it means. But for our purposes, we'll ignore it for now. If we have time, we may revisit it at a later date. Okay, let's take a closer look at this Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, and let me ask you a couple of questions that you're going to answer in your notes. Question 1. In what 2 locations, and I mean right or left on the diagram, do you find the coolest stars? So what location, right or left, do you find the coolest stars? Write that answer in your notes right now. If you said the coolest stars are on the right side, you'd be correct. Now, the reason is because red is a cooler color. So on the right-hand side, you see all the red stars, therefore the cooler stars. Okay, question 2. Now how about the hottest stars? Where are they located? So write that answer in your notes. Now you can clearly see that the hottest stars, or the blue stars, are located on the left side of the diagram. Question number 3. In what location, now I mean upper or lower, do you find the largest stars? So write that down in your notes. Where do you find the largest stars? If you said upper, or more specifically the upper right side, you would be correct. You can see there's some blue giants on the left, but for the most part, those bigger stars are on the upper and upper right side. And then where would we find the smallest stars? We'd find those on the lower left, where it says white dwarfs. Make sure you get these general locations down in your notes right now. Remember that stars burn hydrogen into helium in their cores in a process called nuclear fusion. Now you should have that in your notes already, but it might be a good idea to write that down just as a reminder. So do that now if you need to. We also know that it's the balance between the inward pull of gravity from the core and the outward push of thermal energy generated by nuclear fusion that balances a star out and allows it to stay round and shine. Again, you should have that in your notes, but if you want to write it down to recall it, that'd be fine right now. Now, as long as there's enough hydrogen fuel in a star's core, this balance continues. Write that down. Stars with this balance are called main sequence or adult stars. Write that down. Our sun is on the main sequence. It's a main sequence or adult star right now. It's 4.6 billion years old and has lived about half its life. Also write that down. Now, recall that main sequence stars are located down the middle of the HR diagram from top left to lower right. So look at the diagram that you've made in your notes and see where the main sequence stars are, and you'll see that's where our sun is. Now, when the hydrogen begins to get depleted in the core of stars, what that means is that it's converted into more helium than is hydrogen left. The amount of thermal energy generated decreases. And really what happens is gravity starts to win. Write that down. So when most of the hydrogen starts to get converted into helium, gravity wins out over thermal energy. Now, this is the first sign that a star is beginning to die or burn itself out. So write that down. Remember, we're talking about the life cycle of a star. So stars start to get old or older as most of their hydrogen gets converted into helium. Okay, now to the actual life cycle of stars. So get ready to write again. The life cycle of a star is determined by its mass, or how much hydrogen and helium it is, or how much hydrogen and helium it has in its core. Write that down. Now we're going to look at the masses of 3 classes of stars and make a flow chart for each, much like is shown in this slide. First, let's look at sun-like stars. What do we mean by sun-like stars? You can see that it means that sun-like stars are stars with the same mass, or about 1.5 times our sun's mass. Write that down. Now, when the hydrogen fuel in our sun's core begins to run out, it will eventually cool down and swell into a red giant. So write that explanation in your notes and write red giant next in your flow chart. Now eventually the huge red atmosphere will explode off into space and turn into a planetary nebula. Write that explanation in your notes and planetary nebula next in your flow chart. Now the name planetary nebula implies that somehow our sun will turn into a planet, but that is not where the name comes from. Planetary nebula refers to the size of the core of our sun after its atmosphere explodes off into space. It will be planet-sized instead of the original star-sized it was. Write that down in your notes. Now it's worth remembering that this is all happening because gravity is winning the battle. And that's happening because the hydrogen fuel is running out in the core of sun-like stars. Now, as gravity squeezes the core, it gets smaller and smaller. Write that down in your notes. Now, in this case, it turns from a planetary nebula into a white dwarf and eventually into a black dwarf. Add those to your flow chart now. As far as we know, this black dwarf just drifts around in space and signals the end of our sun's life and the life of stars roughly its size.